The bell rang sharply, signaling the start of another school day. Still, for Elijah Carter, it was just the beginning of yet another uphill battle. As he settled into his desk, a faint sigh escaped his lips, barely audible over the buzz of morning chatter. It wasn't that Elijah disliked school. In fact, he loved learning. The weight of unspoken expectations and the constant need to prove himself made each day feel heavier than the last. Being among the few black students in his suburban school came with challenges. His parents often reminded him, "You have to work twice as hard to get half as far." Those words echoed in his mind as he opened his notebook, determined to meet the day head-on. Across the room, Ms. Charlene Whitaker stood with a stern expression, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her icy demeanor had become a fixture in Elijah's academic life. She wasn't overtly hostile, but her interactions with him showed an unmistakable air of dismissal. Small things, barely noticeable to others, made her bias clear. The subtle eye rolls when he raised his hand, the curt tone she used only when addressing him, and the way she always seemed to find fault in his work. The class began with a simple exercise, a review of last night's homework. Elijah, always meticulous, had completed his assignment with care. But as Ms. Whitaker scanned the room, her gaze landed on him with a sharpness that sent a chill down his spine. "Elijah," she called, her voice cutting through the air, "why don't you come up and explain your answers? Let's see if you actually understood the material." Elijah froze for a moment, the room suddenly feeling smaller. The eyes of his classmates turned toward him, some curious, others sympathetic. He felt the weight of her words, not a request, but a challenge. Swallowing his hesitation, he gathered his notebook and stood, unaware that this moment would change everything.
Elijah Carter wasn't new to stand out. From a young age, his parents had taught him that his skin color would sometimes make people see him differently. They had also taught him to be proud of himself and never let anyone define his worth. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Elijah learned early on that success didn't come easy, especially for people like him. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse, and his father, a mechanic, spent long hours at the shop to make ends meet. Despite their busy schedules, they always found time to remind Elijah of the importance of education. Elijah took their words to heart. While other kids his age played video games or hung out at the park after school, Elijah could often be buried in books at the library. He loved learning about everything from history to science, and his teachers in elementary school praised his curiosity. But as he got older, he started noticing the subtle ways the world tried to put him in a box. Some teachers seemed surprised by how well he did on tests. Others assumed he needed extra help before even looking at his work. By the time he reached high school, Elijah had grown used to the double standards. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes because people quickly judge. He worked harder than anyone else in his class, determined to prove them wrong. But no matter how much effort he put in, moments always reminded him of the hurdles he faced. Ms. Whitaker was one of those hurdles. She wasn't the first teacher to underestimate him, but she was the most obvious. From the very first day of class, Elijah could sense her disapproval. It wasn't anything she said outright. It was in the way she acted. She never called on him unless she was sure he didn't know the answer. And when he did well, she rarely acknowledged it. For someone like Elijah, who was already carrying the weight of high expectations from his family, her constant scrutiny felt like another burden. Despite this, Elijah didn't let it show. He walked into her classroom daily, his head held high, determined to rise above her judgment. His parents had taught him to choose his battles wisely, and he believed that his success would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. But deep down, the pressure was exhausting. He often wondered if things would ever get easier, if there would ever come a day when he didn't have to prove himself just to be treated equally. Outside of school, Elijah found solace in his family and friends. His parents were his biggest supporters, always cheering him on and reminding him of his potential. His best friend Marcus was his rock, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood. Together, they helped Elijah navigate the ups and downs of high school life. But even their encouragement couldn't completely erase the sting of moments like the one in Miss Whitaker's classroom. As Elijah walked back to his desk that morning after her comment, he felt the familiar mix of determination and frustration bubbling inside him. He had faced such moments before and knew he would face them again. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. This wasn't just another bad day in a biased classroom. Something about how Ms. Whitaker looked at him and how her words lingered in the air felt heavier than usual. Elijah didn't know it yet, but this moment would soon become a turning point. This moment would challenge everything he believed about himself and the world around him. For now, all he could do was keep moving forward, holding on to the values his parents had instilled in him, and hoping that his perseverance would someday make a difference. Elijah's school sat in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the lawns were neatly trimmed and the streets rarely saw more than the occasional jogger or dog walker. The school building was a mix of old and new, red brick walls that had stood for decades, now lined with modern glass windows reflecting the morning sun. For many students, it was just a regular high school. Still, for Elijah, it often felt like a proving ground, where every action was scrutinized and every mistake magnified. The classroom where Elijah spent much of his time was like any other. Rows of desks arranged in neat lines, posters of historical figures, and motivational quotes pinned to the walls, and a whiteboard at the front covered in notes when the first bell rang. Despite its ordinary appearance, this room held a unique tension for Elijah. Here, under the watchful eyes of Miss Whitaker, he felt the unspoken challenge of balancing his love for learning with the constant weight of being underestimated. That morning, the atmosphere in the classroom was deceptively calm. Students shuffled in, chatting about everything from last night's basketball game to the latest viral video. Elijah sat quietly at his desk near the middle of the room, pulling out his notebook and neatly arranging his materials. He had always believed that preparation was half the battle, and today was no different. Ms. Whitaker entered shortly after, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She carried herself with an air of authority, her gaze sweeping the room as if to remind everyone who was in charge. Her presence alone was enough to quiet the chatter, and soon the only sound was the rustling of papers and the hum of the overhead projector. For Elijah, this was the routine. He had learned to tune out the subtle ways Ms. Whitaker seemed to single him out, the pointed comments, the extra scrutiny, but today her demeanor felt colder than usual. She moved through the lesson briskly, her voice sharp as she explained the day's objectives. Elijah listened intently, taking detailed notes as she spoke. He knew falling behind wasn't an option, no matter how much harder he had to work to keep up. The lesson progressed, and Ms. Whitaker began reviewing the homework. She asked a few students to share their answers, offering brief encouragement or correction. When it was Elijah's turn, she didn't ask him to contribute like the others. Instead, she directed him to the front of the room, her tone leaving little room for negotiation. "Elijah, why don't you explain your answers to the class?" she said, her voice laced with something Elijah couldn't quite name. Dismissal, maybe, or doubt. As Elijah made his way to the front, the familiar mix of nerves and determination coursed through him. He glanced at the whiteboard, the equations and diagrams seeming to blur briefly before snapping back into focus. His classmates watched silently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and sympathy. The air in the room felt heavy, and Elijah could feel the moment's weight pressing down on him. He wasn't sure why this particular day felt different. Still, something about how Ms. Whitaker looked at him, expectant and almost smug, made it clear that this wasn't just a simple request. It was a test that Elijah knew he couldn't afford to fail. As he stood at the front of the room, notebook in hand, Elijah took a deep breath. The classroom was silent except for the faint hum of the projector. This was his world, an ordinary room filled with ordinary students. But for Elijah, it was a place where he had to fight every day to prove he belonged. Elijah stood at the front of the classroom, gripping his notebook tightly. The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. Every pair of eyes was on him, but Ms. Whitaker's gaze weighed the most. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was sharp, as though she was waiting for him to stumble. "Elijah," she said, her tone clipped and impatient, "let's not waste time. Explain your process, step by step." He glanced at the whiteboard where the problem from last night's homework was displayed. It was a math problem, a subject he enjoyed and excelled at. Still, the tension in the room made him feel unsure of himself. Swallowing his nerves, he began explaining how he had arrived at his answer. His voice was steady at first, but as he continued, he noticed Ms. Whitaker's face harden, her expression shifting into something resembling disdain. "That's not correct," she interrupted, her tone cutting through his explanation. Elijah froze, confused. He looked at his notebook again, double-checking his work. He was sure he had done it right. His heart raced as he turned to her, trying to remain composed. "I think it is, ma'am," he said politely, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. Ms. Whitaker raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Are you questioning me?" she asked, her voice cold. "No, ma'am," Elijah replied quickly, shaking his head. I double-checked my work, and I think it's correct." The class was so quiet that Elijah could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. His classmates exchanged glances, some of them looking sympathetic, others uncomfortable. Miss Whitaker walked over to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "Well, let's see, shall we?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She began writing out the problem, working through it quickly. As she finished, she turned back to Elijah with a smirk. "See? That's the correct answer." Elijah stared at the board, his mind racing. He could see the mistake she had made. It was a small one, but it changed the outcome of the problem. He hesitated, knowing that pointing it out could make things worse. But he also knew that staying silent meant accepting her judgment, which didn't sit right with him. "Actually, ma'am," he said carefully, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "I think there's a small error in the third step. If you carry the 2 here instead of the 1, you'll get the same answer I did." The air in the room grew even heavier as Ms. Whitaker's expression darkened. She stared at the board for a moment before turning back to Elijah. "Are you suggesting I don't know how to solve this problem?" "No, ma'am," Elijah said quickly. "I just wanted to explain how I got my answer." Ms. Whitaker's face flushed, her anger barely concealed. "Sit down," she snapped, her voice sharp and loud. Elijah froze, unsure of what to do. Slowly, he turned and walked back to his desk, his classmates watching him in stunned silence. He could feel the humiliation burning in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his head high. Ms. Whitaker's next words cut through the room like a knife. "This is what happens when you think you know better than your teacher," she said, her tone dripping with scorn. "Perhaps next time you'll listen instead of trying to show off." Elijah sat in his seat, his fists clenched under the desk. He wanted to defend himself, to say anything, but he knew it would only make things worse. As Miss Whitaker turned back to the whiteboard, the class remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. For Elijah, this wasn't just another moment of bias or unfairness. It was a turning point that would stay with him long after the bell rang. Elijah sat at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his pencil. Ms. Whitaker had moved on with the lesson as if nothing had happened, but the sting of her words lingered in the air. The humiliation he felt was sharper than anything he had experienced before. He stared at his notebook, his vision blurring as he blinked back the frustration and hurt that threatened to spill over. For the rest of the class, Elijah struggled to focus. His mind replayed the incident repeatedly, each detail amplifying the unfairness of it all. It wasn't just about being corrected. It was how Ms. Whitaker had dismissed him, her tone making it clear that she saw him as less capable and deserving. It felt like every stereotype he had worked so hard to break was being used against him in that moment. When the bell finally rang, Elijah gathered his things quickly, avoiding the eyes of his classmates as he made his way out of the room. A few of them murmured words of encouragement or sympathy, but he barely heard them. He needed space to breathe, think, and process what had just happened. By lunchtime, the incident had already begun to ripple through the school. Students whispered about what had happened in Ms. Whitaker's class, varying versions of the story. Still, all centered on the tension between Elijah and the teacher. Some admired Elijah for standing up for himself, while others worried about how Ms. Whitaker might retaliate. Elijah couldn't bring himself to eat. He sat with his best friend Marcus, who tried to lighten the mood with jokes and reassurance. "You did the right thing," Marcus said firmly. "Everyone knows you were right. She just couldn't handle it." Elijah nodded, but the weight of the moment still pressed on him. "It doesn't feel like it," he admitted quietly. "It feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "It is enough," he said. "You are enough. Don't let her make you think otherwise." Later that evening, Elijah sat with his parents and recounted the day's events. His mother listened intently, her face a mixture of anger and sadness. His father's jaw tightened, his silence speaking volumes. "We're proud of you," his mother said finally. "It takes courage to stand up for yourself, especially in a situation like that. But you shouldn't have to go through this." Her words brought a small sense of comfort, but ignited a spark of determination in Elijah. He realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. The way Ms. Whitaker had treated him wasn't just unfair. It was a reflection of a system that so often failed to see the potential in students like him. That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he thought about his parents' words, Marcus's support, and the whispers of his classmates. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay silent. This moment wasn't just a failure to be endured. It was a call to action, a chance to make a difference for himself and others like him. By the next morning, Elijah's story had taken on a life of its own. What began as whispered conversations in the school hallways had spread beyond the campus walls. One of his classmates had discreetly recorded part of the incident on their phone and posted it online. The clip captured Ms. Whitaker's dismissive tone, cutting remarks and Elijah's quiet but firm response as he defended his work. The video quickly gained traction, shared across social media platforms, with captions that highlighted the injustice Elijah had faced. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage at Ms. Whitaker's behavior, others commending Elijah for his composure and bravery. Within hours, the video had thousands of views, and by the end of the day, it had gone viral. Elijah didn't realize the extent of the attention until Marcus showed him the video at lunch. His best friend handed him the phone, the screen filled with comments and reposts. "You're trending, man," Marcus said with disbelief and excitement. Elijah stared at the screen, his emotions a whirlwind of confusion, embarrassment, and amazement. "I didn't want this," he muttered, feeling overwhelmed. "I know," Marcus replied, "but maybe this is bigger than you now. People are talking about it, Elijah. They're standing up for you." The support came from all directions. Parents from the school, community leaders, and even strangers reached out, offering encouragement. Some shared stories of similar experiences, creating a wave of solidarity. Others called for accountability, demanding that the school address Ms. Whitaker's actions. At the same time, the attention brought mixed emotions for Elijah. While he appreciated the support, he also felt exposed. This was a deeply personal moment he hadn't planned to share with the world. Yet as the days passed, he began to see how the public reaction sparked meaningful conversations about fairness, bias, and the challenges students like him faced. The school administration quickly became aware of the situation. The principal called Elijah and his parents in for a meeting, acknowledging the incident and promising to investigate. Ms. Whitaker, meanwhile, remained silent, her classroom quieter than usual as students exchanged nervous glances. For Elijah, the viral moment was both empowering and humbling. He had never intended to become the center of attention. Still, now that he was, he wanted to use the opportunity wisely. This wasn't just about a single teacher or a single classroom. It was about creating a space where every student felt valued and supported, no matter who they were or where they came from. As the public conversation grew, Elijah reflected on his role in it. The story was no longer just his. It had become a catalyst for change, a chance to shine a light on issues that often went unnoticed. And while the journey ahead felt uncertain, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Elijah, but also marked a profound shift in his life. The school's administration concluded their investigation and formally apologized to Elijah and his family. Ms. Whitaker was placed on administrative leave, and the school committed to implementing bias training for all teachers, a small but significant step forward. For Elijah, the apology was bittersweet. While it was good to see the issue addressed, the incident had left an indelible mark. Yet instead of letting the experience weigh him down, he chose to rise above it. With the support of his family, friends, and the community, he began to see this moment as an opportunity for growth, not just for himself, but for others who faced similar challenges. The outpouring of support from strangers continued to amaze him. Letters and messages flooded in from people across the country, sharing their stories and expressing how Elijah's courage inspired them. Students like him, who had felt unseen or dismissed, now felt a spark of hope. One evening, Elijah was invited to speak at a local community forum. Standing in front of a room filled with parents, teachers, and students, he took a deep breath and shared his story. His voice was steady as he spoke about the importance of fairness, the power of standing up for oneself, and the need for change in how students are treated in classrooms. "I wasn't looking to make a statement," he said, resonating with emotion. "I just wanted to be treated with respect, like anyone else. But now I see that this isn't just about me. It's about making sure every student feels valued and supported, no matter what they look like or where they come from." The room erupted into applause, but Elijah felt more than pride. He felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of his journey, but just the beginning. The experience taught Elijah that there was an opportunity to create something positive, even in moments of pain and injustice. It also reminded him of the strength that came from community and solidarity. He knew much work was still to be done, but he was no longer afraid to speak up and make his voice heard. As the attention around his story faded, Elijah returned to his studies with a renewed sense of determination. He knew that his success would be the ultimate way to defy expectations and show that he was capable of greatness. To those who supported him, Elijah's story symbolized resilience and hope. And to anyone who heard it, it carried a simple but powerful message. Every voice matters, and every person deserves to be seen and heard. Elijah's journey wasn't just his own. It was a call to action for everyone to reflect on their biases and strive for a world where kindness, fairness, and respect were the norm.